Just wanted to talk about the construction and design of this retaining wall for this garden landscape. Building the foundations, building this hollow block wall with reinforced concrete and steel, this natural stone wall over here.
You come and go like a monsoon rain. You hide and show like a lightning bolt. You have it all.
A ramped pathway. This is so you can get access to this lower backyard. We used a couple of existing parts of the yard, like the deck was already here, so we've tied everything into this deck. One of the features we put in this terrace system was this natural stone wall that ties into our hollow block wall.
In this YouTube video, I'll take you through all the procedures I used to create this terrace garden with retaining walls, ramped pathways and a central garden bed.
Daydreamer, kitten and maid, take me back, all the way back to them days.
After creating a detailed scale drawing of our project, I set up some temporary framing timber on stakes to help me plan the excavation for our site. These timbers represent the height and alignment of the main retaining wall that'll be tying into the existing deck.
We're just continuing to do a bit of demolition here. Take out this old lattice.
We spent summers catching fireflies and winters on our skates. One big smile across my face.
This is all the material we removed for today. Always strap your load down really tight. You don't want anything falling off and causing a traffic hazard.
Take me back, all the way back to them days.
This stake is buried so deep in the ground it requires a leverage system to pull it out. We drill a hole in the stake and get a 2x4 and then use the length of the 2x4 as a leverage to pull out the stake.
This morning we're just going to get rid of this temporary ramp we set up for moving materials from the front to the backyard. The wall goes right through that ramp.
I have old concrete foundations I have to demolish and remove. I'll recycle this concrete and use it in the natural stone wall we're building later. All the excess dirt that needs to be removed for our foundation is being dumped in a location that'll be a raised garden bed in a future project.
The next stage in our process is going to be building the foundation for this wall. So I thought I'd give you a preview of the size of the wall that we're building on this foundation so you understand why we're going to be doing it so wide and deep and there's so much steel on it. We've boarded the foundation on this end with treated timber because it's going to be left exposed, but it still works just like a form for shaping our concrete foundation. The only difference between this and a normal formwork is we're leaving it in the ground. So we're trying to keep it all clean as we pour our foundation. And this block's sitting directly on that concrete foundation we're about to build and pour out. It also has a drainage system in it for all the water that this wall will dam up. Yeah, here we are on the back side of the wall we're going to end up with. We can see the exposed foundation that's double the thickness of our wall block. It's part of the engineering strength that stops this wall from getting pushed forward by this dirt mass.
We're using treated pine timber for some of the formwork in this wall, as it's going to stay in the ground and be part of the border system. We need to set this timber level in the trench we cut through the concrete earlier. We're going to start our formwork at the lowest point, and in this project the lowest point has an open drain system because of the doorway to the shed here. So we're going to set the heights here and then know that we have to be slightly higher than this to keep all the water draining into this part of the yard. We use our string and level to set pegs in the ground. This string represents where the wall will end up, so our foundation has to be directly underneath this point. We continue to add our form pieces along the wall line, directly below the string we laid out before. The form for this foundation contains steps in it. The steps raise up 200 mil from the previous form.
We also had to put some plumbing in before we get the concrete in the ground. And this will be hooked up to add pipe once we get our foundation and wall in. So this will be the system that drains all the water that gets trapped behind the wall like in a dam, and that'll come down here.
We installed this 90mm PVC pipe under our formwork so it'll get buried with the concrete and gravel. Our gravel base is a critical part of the engineering of this wall system. It provides a stable base for our concrete foundation and allows water to drain underneath the concrete without erosion and causing subsidence and cracking later.
A couple more loads, I'll have this up to the height I want.
For a wall of this height and weight, we want to have about 100mm of gravel bedding underneath it. Using our shovel and rake, we just work the gravel through this trench system so we get a nice even coverage.
Mix gravel with rock dust in it so it compacts really tight, but water can still sort of move through it without creating erosion.
These forms are for the ramp system that wraps around the outside corner of the wall. It made sense to put these footings in at the same time as the wall footings so we could tie everything together in one big structure. The next process for these footings is to install the steel we need to reinforce the concrete in our foundations. We start this process by taking measurements of our trenches. The product we're using here is called trench mesh. It's made up of 3 pieces of reinforcing bar welded together with cross pieces.
9 to 5 was my dad's advice. Don't think twice, I want the luxury life. My beauty can lose it, I'll use it. I'll take what I want.
With our pieces cut to size, we're ready to install them in our footings. For the moment, we just place the mesh in our trench, because later we'll be tying these together with wire. We use these plastic supports which are specifically designed for holding the rebar at a certain height for the maximum adhesion in the concrete system. They're made to lock into the rebar and hold it up so the concrete can flow underneath and keep the whole system stable so when you're pouring concrete, your mesh doesn't move out of alignment. We go through the entire foundation installing these supports and make sure we've got good firm coverage.
Spending Sunday at the gym, trying to fit in. Counting the days until I meet my future husband. I try to be kind to myself. I said, girl, you got this.
The next step in preparing our steel for this foundation is to install our vertical pieces of steel, which will help lock in the concrete block that we add later. We have to cut these pieces out of our 6-metre stock of 12mm rebar. Once we have a piece cut to the right length, we just use that as a measurer to cut the other pieces.
I needed 24 of these, so I switched to my bigger grinder just to speed up the process, and then I've got to cut a bunch of short ones. These are going to go in vertically with our concrete, leave them sticking up so the blocks go over the top of them and it all ties the block wall into the concrete foundation.
When installing our vertical pieces of rebar, we use the reference mark we've put on the side of our forms. These reference marks relate to where our hollow concrete block is going to align on the foundations, because we want this rebar to go up in the middle of them. The vertical rebar gets tied into the trench mesh with special wire tabs. Once we're satisfied the position is correct, we tighten the whole system up with our pliers.
It's a whole lot of ticket, not enough time, not enough time. A whole lot of work for this trophy life, oh my. A whole lot of thinking behind these eyes, behind these eyes, behind these eyes, behind these eyes.
The ramped pathway that wraps around the corner of our retaining wall has a treated timber rail, so I'm installing some of the treated timber planking as it's incorporated into the concrete foundation.
Spending Sunday at the gym, trying to fit in. Counting the days until I meet my future husband. I try to be kind to myself. I said, girl, you got this.
For this kind of a foundation pour, I'm going to use a 6:1 ratio of Portland cement to the gravel sand mix. We're adding 1 shovel load of the Portland cement, but I do it in small pieces so it can mix properly in the mixer. By looking inside the mixer as it's going, you can observe the concrete peeling off or falling off the sides of the mixer. This is how we can tell when the mix is just right, not too wet and not too dry. This particular job site has very limited access to where the concrete has to end up. It's not uncommon to have restricted access to people's backyards, so I'm used to this kind of system. We dump our concrete into this custom-built trough as a way of managing the concrete into our foundation system. This makes it easy for us to dump the wet concrete mix, and then from here we can shovel it through the trench system. Getting all this concrete into our foundation is a bit like managing a river system. We dump the concrete at the top end of the system, and then we just keep manipulating it all the way through till the very end. Once we have a sufficient amount of concrete in our forms, we trowel it off smooth and add the upright rebar pieces we're going to need for locking in our hollow blocks later. We need all the vertical pieces of rebar to fall in the center of our hollow block, so we've got to lay them out carefully to a measured system. I made myself a measuring stick with clear marks on it so I know how to lay out this vertical rebar in the right position. We just tap them in with our hammer to get them to the right depth so they're not all the way through the bottom of the concrete. Once we've got our foundations filled at this end of our trench, you start working on the other end of the foundation and filling that with concrete. We're just using our shovel to get the concrete up to the rough height of our forms, and then later we'll be using our trowel to get a more exact level. All our timber forms for these foundations have been set at the exact level we want, so the idea is to get the concrete slightly underneath that level. So later when we connect the concrete block, we've got room for some mortar underneath it. We're very gently tapping in these pieces of rebar as we don't want to put them through the bottom of the concrete. We're using the same jig we used earlier that has preset marks on it, so we can line up the vertical rebar so it ends up in the middle of the holes of the concrete block. This foundation has multiple levels as we're trying to come up the side of this hill. So when we're adding our concrete, we obviously start at the bottom and then move up to the higher forms as we fill the bottom forms. This last form is the highest form in the system, so once we've poured this out, we're going to be finished for the day.
Of all the magic places in the world I've been to, this is where my heart is. Oh, you know it's true. No matter where I go, I'm coming home to you. Been walking down the street so many times, my feet know every brick and stone. Could wear a blindfold. No matter what I do, I'm coming home to you.
This morning we're going to rip out our formwork now that our concrete's dry for our foundations. Just unscrew it and pull it apart.
I've seen many places where the beauty never ends. Different cities, friendly faces, and perhaps I'm going back. But I don't have to be chasing every dream that I have. Oh, no. 'Cause the thing is, I've got more love here than I can bear. Ooh.
Now we're going to do a bit of a clean up and build a safety step. Got to get materials in because I've sort of blocked off my pathway to get all my block into this wall. So we're going to build a temporary step over here.
Been walking down the street so many times, my feet know every brick and stone. Could wear a blindfold. No matter what I do, I'm coming home to you.
The next stage in this project is going to be to build up this corner ramp system where we're going to use concrete block. These hollow blocks will fit right over the top of the rebar that we set in our foundation, and the foundation height is set slightly under what we need, so we'll be using packers to get the blocks at exactly the right height. By swapping out different combinations of packers, thickers, eventually we get it to the height that we need. We have to cut the entire back out of this block because this block will be joining to the other part of the concrete foundation.
This is the block. It's back cut out. Then a notch cut in here and a notch cut in there.
The slots we've cut in this block is for the horizontal rebar, which is part of the engineering strength of this system. With all the blocks cut and returned to their original positions, we wash everything down to make sure it's nice and clean for when we cement these blocks in later. With all the blocks adjusted to the right height and with 10mm gaps between them, we gently add mortar into the hollow part of the blocks until the mortar starts to come out from the bottom. We just keep agitating the mortar with our trowel until the mortar comes out the bottom of the blocks in between the packers. Once we've got enough cement on the bottom of these blocks to hold them in place, we fill in the gaps between the blocks until we get it filled all the way to the top. Once our mortar's all set and solid, it's time to remove all the packers. We're going to pull out our packers with these pliers. We just go around the entire wall and remove all the packers we can.
But I don't have to be chasing every dream that I have. Oh, no.
With our block wall complete, we move on to the other parts of this foundation system. The first thing we're going to have to do is remove this dirt to make room for the foundation we're going to need for the rest of this ramp. We just chip away carefully with our mattock. As like before, we're trying to use some of these dirt walls as our forms for the next concrete pour, so we don't want to over dig our holes. Now that our excavation is all flat and trim, it's time to check things with a level and a tape measure to see what our next part will be. As we successfully excavate each step to the right height, we just move on to the next step above it. Here I'm using the level to make a mark with my spade to keep everything at the right level. Now that we've successfully cut a dirt step into this hillside, it's ready for us to build our formwork. We're going to start our process by setting the edge of the top step and work our way down from there. Once our 2x4 is set to the right level on top of the packers, we just tap the stake down flush to the top of the 2x4. We just do one last double check with our square to make sure everything's going to come out plumb. We've pre-assembled a piece of the wall form here that's going to create the step that sits on top of the original concrete we poured for the whole wall. We set this in place and then continue to join timbers on it to create the top step for the ramp. I'm installing the last major piece of this formwork. Now that the formwork is complete, I just double check over everything to make sure I've got enough strength to hold the concrete in the right place when we pour it.
Once we pour the concrete and rip it out, it'll all make sense.
Now that all the timber work is complete for this formwork and we've installed all the reinforcement steel, it's ready for concrete. This phase of the construction of our foundation for the ramp system that goes around the corner of this wall is going to involve pouring out this top threshold section that is the very top of the system and then all the way along the outside perimeter. This is what's going to create the edge for our ramp system that takes us down in 2 tiers onto the lower part of the yard. Today I'm going to be mixing my standard concrete ratio of 6 part gravel sand to 1 part Portland cement, but we're adding an important additive here. We're adding a product that's called Bondcrete, where I come from. But essentially it's a bit like a glue additive you add into the cement, and it helps it adhere to already poured concrete. And seeing we're pouring over the top of our original foundations, we're adding this in to help it bond to it.
So easy to drag on, but not what it seems. The poison is spilling upstream, and it's taking out.
For this part of the project, we're dumping the concrete into these plastic tubs to make it more manageable to pour into the forms. This rain isn't heavy enough to have a significant effect on our concrete, so we're going to carry on. This first batch of concrete that we've mixed up has the Bondcrete additive in it, so we're just trying to get a thin coat of this specially mixed concrete on all our forms where there's pre-existing concrete, kind of like a glue, and then we'll be adding standard concrete as we go throughout the day. We just continue this agitation throughout all the forms, so this way our concrete will stick really well to the old concrete. As the concrete fills this form, we become a little more gentle with our agitating because we've got a slope here and we don't want to push the concrete down the slope. Once we've got all the concrete to the top of this form, we smooth it out with our trowel and move on to the next phase. This is one of the deepest forms in this pour, so we use a bit of extra agitation to make sure that we can get the concrete all the way to the bottom of these forms. Now that all the forms on the lower levels are filled, we can finally get to this top part, which is the threshold to the whole ramp system. With all the other forms completely full and smoothed off, this is the last one we have to get filled.
Could you listen to somebody else? Will you only drink from the thoughts of yourself? Are you under the canopy spell?
We'll be ripping out all the formwork to reveal our finished concrete for this part of the ramp system. The only tools we're going to need for this process is our impact driver, our lump hammer and our small crowbar to pry some of these timbers away. As we get down to some of the larger pieces of timber form, they can be a bit of a struggle to get out. We just have to be patient, use our crowbar gently so we don't damage our concrete too much, and just keep levering it until eventually it comes free.
So that's all the timber taken out of this formwork. A little bit of a struggle, but she came up nice.
Now that the outer ramp concrete wall is complete, we're going to move on to completing some of these treated timber retaining wall sections.
Back up the driveway, could you see what this is? This is a part of it all.
As I've mentioned in other episodes, I always drill pilot holes before I put my screws in to avoid splitting the timber and overstressing the timber. Part of the preparation for the next concrete pour is to add gravel into the ramp foundation we just created so we can get the concrete closer to where we need it. I'm filling the cement block we laid earlier with concrete as a way of completing our pathway enough so I can use it to bring all the hollow concrete block I need in. I'm setting up a pallet on the lump of dirt we excavated earlier as a convenient place to store the hollow block close to where we'll be working.
Hey darling, I love it when it's me and you on the road with a couple of tunes in a car for two. Hey darling, you know we're gonna have a really good time, driving in the middle of the night when the stars are bright.
Now that our foundation's had enough time to set solid, we're going to get started on our block wall, and we're going to commence with our cornerstone. This cornerstone has to be placed in exactly the right position as all the other blocks are going to join to it. And we're using a system of dry setting our block wall so there's no mortar in between to make up for any gaps. So this has to be placed in exactly the right spot. We're aligning this corner block with the existing deck so the wall and the deck will line up together and look architecturally pleasing. Once we're satisfied it's level, we take some measurements for the blocks we're going to have to make cutouts for. We have to do cutouts on these bricks for engineering purposes so the concrete and steel can flow through everything properly. We'll be cutting our concrete block on our wet saw. I always wear eye and ear protection when I'm operating my wet saw. And we have to cut notches for the reinforcement bar to be able to fit between all the blocks for its engineering strength. So we have to cut it on a couple of different sides, lined up to that corner block. After slicing the block with our wet saw, we just use our lump hammer to tap out the voids necessary for this rebar that's going to go through all the whole system. We wash it clean with our hose after we're finished cutting because we don't want any of the residue to impair the concrete sticking to it later on.
Let's get out, we can leave this city. Let's drive to the open air. Yeah, the countryside is so pretty with the wind blowing in your hair.
We place our prepared block tightly against our corner block. As I mentioned before, we're doing dry set so there's no mortar gap between these blocks. When we're satisfied with a tight fit in our alignment, we just lay the next block next to it, double checking with our level and adjusting our packers to create a 10mm gap underneath. Adjusting the block to be completely level can take a bit of time, swapping out different thickness packers to get it exactly plumb. We continue to double check with our small level that all the blocks are lining up perfectly flat with each other. As we lay out the blocks to the end of this row, we can see that they're all lining up perfectly with the rebar we set inside our foundation. We continue to just lay the blocks out hard up against each other, adjusting with the packers as we need to. This first course is only a small course because of our configuration of our wall. It has a full block step down in it. We're just trying to get this small section of the wall laid out today so we can set it up with cement and then put the second course on top, which will continue over to the full length of the wall. Here I'm adjusting this block back into alignment as gently as possible so they all stay dead straight. Here you can see the cutouts on the back of the blocks line up with the vertical rebar in the foundation. We'll be tying rebar through those cutouts later after we've got these blocks set in concrete. We designed this foundation so it'd be 10 mil lower than it should be. That way we can have our 10 mil packers underneath the blocks. This will help the concrete spread out underneath and glue the block to the concrete foundation later on, as you'll see. Because we couldn't make the foundation exactly 10 mil lower than our finish height, we have to adjust with different size packers. So some of them might need an 8 mil packer and some might need a 12 mil packer.
So the first course is laid. Just going to fill that with a little bit of concrete to lock it in before we put our next course on.
I use a slightly specialised concrete mix for this process. It has bondcrete in it to help the block adhere to the concrete foundation. It also has 1 shovel load of mortar mixed in with my normal 6:1 ratio of concrete mix. This is to help it flow underneath the blocks to get a really good adhesion. We pour this concrete in our blocks really gently because there's nothing actually holding these blocks to the foundation at this point. But because they're all tightly packed up against each other, they're quite stiff and solid in their place. So as long as we don't bump them or pour too much concrete in at once, they won't move. But the trick here is to be very gentle as we pour the concrete in. Just keep an even spread of concrete throughout the whole wall. And we're trying to fill about 50 to 100 mil in the bottom of each block so the concrete pushes through underneath. This is what's going to stick the concrete to the foundation. Once we've poured our first batch of concrete into the block, we start agitating the concrete to make sure it pushes through underneath, through the packers and spills out onto the foundation. This is acting like a glue. It's going to bond these blocks to the foundation. This is something I take my time at and kind of enjoy the process as I've done all this work to get to this stage. And I want this bottom course of block to stick really solidly to the foundation. So I'm just going to take my time and make sure all the concrete goes through all the little cracks and voids.
Pack our bags and get in that car. Leave a little note and we'll drive real far.
Get the wet cement down deep in those voids in the concrete blocks. So a little bit of it seeps through underneath because it's sitting up on 10 mil packers. This will help the concrete bind the block to the foundation. Plus we have the rebar, which is all tying it together. This is a way of setting up blocks so we can lay more blocks on top tomorrow when these are set up.
Let's get out, we can leave this city. Let's drive to the open air. Yeah, the countryside is so pretty with the wind blowing in your hair.
With our first batch of concrete all agitated in, we add another batch of concrete on top to create a really solid bond with this foundation. We take extra care when we're pouring the concrete into this hollow block because we're using split-faced block. It's highly textured on the facet that's going to be exposed in the final job, and concrete can stick to it quite easily and stain it. So we take extra care to not get concrete on, and if we do, we wash it off immediately. We continue to spread the concrete evenly throughout the block system, trying to fill enough concrete inside each block so a little bit spills over in the cutout we created with our wet saw. Once our final load of concrete is poured into our block, we go back to agitating the concrete, pushing it through all the voids and cracks. We take our time with this process because we need this first course to stick really solidly to the foundation, as we have 4 more courses to sit on top of it. At the very end, when we fill this with concrete, it's really the rebar and the concrete inside the block that holds the whole system together. But as we're constructing it, this part of the process is what's going to hold the wall up. You can see here how the corner block is not hollow like the standard blocks. It's solid and half the thickness of a standard hollow block. But by piling up the cement behind it with the rebar, it'll stay solid in place. This is a good example of how we push the concrete through all the voids we created with our wet saw, with the gaps that join the blocks together and the cutout on the back of the block. The end of this block wall ties into a natural stone wall here, which we haven't got started yet. But once we get the first couple of courses of this block wall in, we'll be building the foundations for this stone wall that ties into this back corner. That's going to help hold up this block wall.
Yeah, so we've filled it all with cement, kind of worked it in best we can. And that sets up, they're all locked into the foundation. And then later we're going to backfill this whole area with concrete and recycle bits of concrete just to create a big masonry mass.
After finishing this first course, it's nice to take a break and enjoy the surroundings.
But there's some words that I just wanna hear you say, to put it all straight before this night turns into day, and then I'm on my way.
Well, yesterday we got the first foundation block in. Because our foundation steps up, we'll get our first course on this upper foundation level.
We're just going to scrape off some of this spilt cement. Seeing it was just poured yesterday, it comes off quite easily. We don't want this getting in the way of how our blocks lay out on the next course. After cleaning all the cement off our block, we've got to cut some rebar so we can insert them in the slots that we cut on our wet saw. The rebar is 6 meters long, so we need to cut up a bunch of 300mm small lengths. And of course, for safety reasons, I always wear eye and ear protection when I'm cutting steel. The rebar in this system is what holds the whole wall together. It's what adds all the strength that stops this wall from being pushed down by the hill. So these small pieces of rebar are going to tie the blocks into the concrete that we're going to pour behind these blocks. We use these rod ties. Just makes it quicker and easier to lock your rebar together instead of cutting up bits of wire. The idea here is to connect all our rebar together to create a unified system. So these small pieces of rebar are going to be connected to the rebar we set in our foundation that is sitting up vertically, and these will lay horizontally and connect between them. We use these small pieces of wire to tie them together. This wire isn't to really create any strength in the system as much as to just keep the rebar in the right place when we pour concrete over it. We pre-tie our small tabs of wire onto the short lengths of rebar, so then we can anchor them onto the vertical pieces of rebar. Once we have it set to the correct height, we tie off the horizontal piece of rebar onto our vertical piece coming out of our foundation. I just use my fingers to get the system started, and then I tighten it off with my pliers to make it really strong so the concrete won't move this when we pour it later. Here I've used a piece of scrap concrete to hold the piece of rebar in the right position. I'll remove this later when we pour the concrete in. Once we've got a couple of our horizontal pieces tied in, we're ready to put a big long horizontal piece for the back side of the wall. This is a good example of how I use my fingers to twist the wires around the rebar to get it started, and then finish it off with the pliers to make it really strong. With our longer piece of rebar secured on the back of the system, I can finish off these small 300mm pieces by resting them on top of the longer piece. This is forming a steel grid pattern through our concrete block. The last pieces of rebar we need to add to finish this off are the pieces that actually go through the block. that go through the cutouts we did on our wet saw. So first I measure to make sure I've got the right length, and then sometimes we have to do some adjustment on the block to get these to fit in. We're using our small grinder with a diamond cutting blade on it to just widen some of the notches in these blocks so the steel can fit through easily. Here I'm cutting a small notch on the inside of our corner block so this rebar can fit behind it for extra strength. We want the rebar to be able to fit through the blocks with a nice gap around it for the concrete to set it in. With all the rebar tied in place, we're ready to continue on the block part of the wall. We start with our cornerstone as we did before, because everything has to tie back into this cornerstone as it lines up with the existing deck. With our cornerstone set in the right place, we're ready to prepare all the other blocks we're going to be joining to it. So the first thing we're going to do is cut all the notches on our wet saw. We're preparing these blocks with our notches the same way we did for the first course, which is to cut out 2 slots at the back of the block and 2 slots either side of the block for the rebar to go through. As with all cutting tools, we let the wet saw do its job by letting the blade get up to its proper speed and allowing it to cut at its own pace through the block without pushing it or forcing it. After cutting the slots in the block, a slight tap with the lump hammer will knock them out. We have one more notch to cut in the block that can't be done on the wet saw because it won't reach through the cutting system, so we do this with the small grinder. Set one of the blocks hard up against the cornerstone and check that everything's coming out plumb and level. With our standard blocks all cut, washed and prepared, we're ready to complete this lower corner of the wall. Starting from our corner block, I just lay them tight up against each other and then double check that they're all level.
You said, let me tell you everything I've seen, the friends I've made, and then you tell me how you've been. Look a little closer, it's been quite some time. You gotta let me know if I'm out of line.
Yeah, so this morning we're just moving a bit more block in. Just try and do that a piece at a time because I've only got so much room here to keep it on these pallets. But I need a few more blocks to finish off this wall section, so we're going to try and empty one of the pallets outside on the street and then we'll get into some laying block.
Part of managing this construction process is looking after my mind and body. And with that in mind, it's good to break up different tasks throughout the day. Moving all the block I need onto site in one session would be kind of brutal on my body and also logistically difficult because we don't have enough space. So it makes sense to move a bunch of blocks on site, get them fixed on the wall, and then move more blocks on site. By breaking this task up, you can actually enjoy it because it creates a variety in your day and keeps you motivated, which leads to a much better outcome in the quality of your project. We have to use a lot of care in transporting and stacking this split face hollow block as it's quite fragile and can chip easily. We don't want the split face to be scratched or damaged in any way. After moving enough block on site for the next part of our project, I take a break and enjoy these beautiful natural surroundings I get to work in. On this job site, there's a lovely paddock below me with these beautiful horses that I often just watch when I'm taking a break. Helps me refocus and get ready for the next part of our project.
When the wind blows and the windows are closing, you let the world know that what has been has been. There's no use in looking back, going back, wishing back.
After taking our morning rest, we're ready to process the rest of the blocks we're going to need to finish this wall today. When you're working by yourself, you have to manage your time and process. So I set goals for what I want to achieve in one particular day, and today we want to have the entire bottom course of this wall laid in ready so we can continue our process. Here you can see how I have all the blocks stacked up vertically in a kind of production line, so I can finish off these cuts we have to do by hand on the small grinder. Now that we've finished processing all the blocks we're going to need to complete this part of the wall, we stack them conveniently right next to where we're going to be working. Before we get started laying out the block for this last bottom course, we're going to do some double checking with our string line levels to make sure the block ends up straight and plumb. The next thing to check is the height that we've set on our corner, making sure that this height is dead level all the way through the system. To make this process manageable, we're breaking this wall up into two halves. I've set a block in the middle of the two halves, so we're sort of treating it like two separate walls. This makes it a bit easier to carry out the process. I can now start laying out the blocks tied up against the corner block system. As our foundation is roughly 10 mil below where the bottom of the block should be, our standard is a 10 mil packer. But due to the variation of the concrete in the foundation, sometimes it'll be slightly more or slightly less than a 10 mil packer. As we continue to lay each block next to each other, we double check its alignment with that center block that we set up earlier, breaking the wall into two halves. We continue to lay blocks until we run into that center block that we set up earlier with our level. Once we get to this stage, we remove that temporary center block and tap in all the other blocks to make sure they're really tight to each other. This completes the process of laying out the first half of this span of wall. We just check back over our blocks to make sure they're all lined up and level.
So I've set this bottom course all the way along. It's all lined up, I've just wet it down.
With the entire first course of these blocks laid out flat and plumb, we're ready to start pouring concrete in them to lock them into this foundation. We're using the same concrete formula we used on the earlier part of our wall when we laid our first row down on the corner, which was our normal 6-part sand and gravel to Portland cement, plus bondcrete, plus 1 shovel load of mortar to help the concrete spread underneath the 10 mil gaps we've created with our packers. We're filling our hollow block about halfway up with this concrete mix before we start agitating it in to push it under those 10 mil gaps we created with our packers. This is what's going to bond these blocks to the foundation. After agitating the concrete along the entire length of the wall from the first pour, we top it up with more concrete. This second batch of concrete should be pouring over the back of the notch we cut in the blocks. Using my trowel, I make sure that the concrete is pushed through the back gap that we'd cut with our wet saw, so the concrete spills over the back bottom edge, so we have a really good adhesion to the foundation. I just continue through the entire length of the wall, working this concrete in thoroughly so we get all the air bubbles out and get a really good bond with the previously poured foundation concrete. This completes the process of setting our first course along the entire wall. Once this sets up, we can put the next course on.
One of the features we put in this terrace system was this natural stone wall. Ties into our hollow block wall. Go through the whole procedure of how this came about, show how it's done.
The first thing we need to do is excavate an area so we can pour a foundation for this stone wall. We don't have a lot of space to work with here, having to dig this out from underneath the deck and between these stumps. We're just trying to excavate enough dirt out of here to get a foundation about 150 mil thick. I'm going to build a small form for this foundation using our treated pine. This form will stay in the ground and creates a border for this wall. But first I'm going to have to rip one of our sleepers in half to get it to the right dimensions. I've set myself up with plenty of space to cut this timber out of the way of where we're working and close to my chop saw. Now that the timber has been ripped down to the right thickness for our foundation, we'll just cut it to size and then go and install it under the deck. The complete form for this stone wall is going to be quite extensive as we have to tie it into a retaining wall for the garden bed. So today we're just going to construct the bottom part of it to get some concrete in the ground and complete the rest later. We're just going to pour a foundation out that's significantly deep and strong, as this small stone wall is part of the entire retaining wall system, even though it looks separate when it's finished because of the decorative stone. From an engineering point of view, it's interconnected to our hollow block wall and is part of what's going to be holding up this hillside. So it has to have a lot of concrete and steel reinforcement to be strong enough to not fail. Once we've agitated all the concrete in and smoothed it off, we're going to let it rest for the day and come back and continue this part of the project tomorrow. While we let this concrete dry, we're going to go rip out the forms on one of our previous pours over on our ramp section. Often our screws are jammed up with concrete in them from the concrete pour, so we just use another screw to drill out the void in the top of the screw so we can get our impact driver in and remove it properly. After removing the small blocks that hold this larger piece of timber in, there should be nothing attaching it to the system, so we're just going to use our crowbar and hammer to tap it out. Part of me managing my construction process on a job like this is to have little pours of concrete going in different places. So as we're waiting for one to set up and harden, we can rip out the forms in another. Getting this ramp landing finished is really important because at this point we don't have any wheeled access down to the lower part of the yard, where we have to take all the concrete block and build that stone wall. So by finishing off this part of the ramp, we can get gravel in here, and then I can use my wheelbarrow to bring materials in. We're going to start out filling this void with some leftover concrete from our demolition earlier. We're just spreading out these lumps of concrete so the black gravel can fit in between them to get a really good base. We just compact it by stamping on it with our feet, and then we just keep adding more layers and just keep repeating the process until we've filled our platform.
Cutting grass and chopping wood can be romantic. Sipping coffee under the apple tree is gentlemanly. Well, you're a good man, quite the best man, a real fine man.
Once the square platform's completely filled and flat with gravel, we get started on the bottom ramp system. Here I'm using much larger pieces of recycled concrete to create a really stable base for this ramp. And then we just repeat the same process we did for the platform. We just keep adding black gravel, raking it in, compacting it.
When the wind blows and the windows are closing, you let the world know that what has been has been. And there's no use in looking back.
With our ramp all filled with gravel, we're going to get back to building this natural stone wall. But first we've got to build some treated timber retaining wall elements that tie into the garden bed that's going to be in the center of this wall.
Just fixing in what's going to be the backing of our natural stone wall we're putting in here.
We're building a treated timber retaining wall around the edge of this deck, which is going to hold the garden bed in and also be the back form of our natural stone wall. So we prefabbed some parts to make it easier for ourselves to build a structure that has to wrap around the bottom of this deck. So everything can line up with this deck properly, we're building this treated timber form wall from the top down.
This was just a temporary brace to hold it at the right height whilst we locked it off into the deck.
Now that this top sleeper is secure to the deck, we can remove this prop.
This natural stone wall is going to be incorporated into the block wall over here in the corner with concrete and rebar, which will help support it. It'll also give my concrete wall strength, because every time you put a corner in a retaining wall, it adds more strength to it. Now that I've got the side all fixed, I can start to work on this back section, put pieces under here.
The treated timber sleepers just slot into the H-bar. We just get them snug up against each other and then screw them off.
Just got a few more pieces to fill out that bottom void, and then we're ready to start building our natural stone wall out of the rocks I have behind me here. So we've put a first course of stone along this piece of timber here as a form for the stone to lay up against. Sometimes we use wire, or we wedge concrete in the back of it, like here, using some scrap pieces from my blocks over here. The idea is to try and keep all this natural cut stone or naturally formed stone as flat to this form as possible. Then we're going to pour concrete in the back of it.
With our first course of stones secure and ready, we wet it all down so the concrete will stick to it really nicely, and we start backfilling it with our concrete. The process here is to quite gently add the concrete into this form without bumping any of the stones, as they're only leaning up against our form. This can be done if you're gentle and take your time. Then we work it in with our trowel so the concrete gets a good adhesion to the stone. I've also used a custom concrete mix for this process, which contains a shovel load of mortar mixed in with our normal 6:1 formula of Portland cement, plus bondcrete, which helps the concrete adhere to the pre-existing foundation slab and also adhere to all our stone. I insert small pieces of recycled concrete, like little wedges, to help stiffen up these stones against the formwork, and then work them into the concrete with my trowel. This is all part of my system for getting these natural stones to stay flat against the formwork. We just keep repeating the process of adding more concrete and adding bits of recycled concrete as wedges until the concrete gets up to the top of the stones. We continue to thoroughly work it with our trowel to make sure we're getting a good adhesion throughout the whole system. We pour concrete into the hollow block system, as this is a way of us tying in this new wall into the hollow block wall. We make sure we work the concrete in thoroughly around all the rebar and this hollow block, as this is a connection point between the two walls and we want it to be as strong as possible. After adding the last batch of concrete, we smooth everything out with our trowel best we can.
Oh, I will open up my eyes so I can see the light. Oh, and I'll try to spread my wings so I can fly.
We'll give it a day or two to dry up and pull this off, see how she's looking, and then we can sort of raise this up as we go. I'm just going to talk about this natural stone wall we're building. It's going to come up to this height. We're using this pink granite over here, and the idea is that across here we have natural stone and tie into our charcoal concrete block that wraps around this way. We lay the stones up to the front of our form here to keep it flat as it goes up, and then we lay a course out, wedging it to the flat side of this timber. Then we backfill it with concrete and reinforcement, and that's what holds the whole thing together. And then as we want to go up, we just add more timbers onto our formwork. We'll just screw that in, make sure we're keeping it level, so we can build another course of this stone, which I'll take you through the process of as we go. It's a lot of fun, this process. As we go up each layer, we just keep adding steel in, so the concrete that's behind the stone is reinforced and stays strong. Yesterday we built out this treated pine wall, which is going to be the form that stays in behind the concrete. We used some steel brackets over here to wrap our garden retaining wall. So this morning the plan is to add this timber onto our formwork so we can build another course of this stone. Yeah, so we're going to level this because the wood can be a bit bent, so we want to make sure we're keeping it vertical. If I was just to screw this down as it is, it's going to be leaning in a bit. So we're going to stick a packer, 1.5mm packer, just on the edge here, kind of keep it vertical.
Once we're satisfied this timber is completely vertical, we fix it off with a screw. We're using 150mm screws because this timber is 95mm thick. And as always, I always drill pilot holes before I bury my screw in to stop the timber splitting.
Just keep it flush on the inside here, that's the plan.
With everything lining up plumb, we fix it off with a couple more screws.
We'll add a brace here to stop this bowing out.
Adding a cross brace somewhere in the middle of your formwork is critical to keep the wall dead straight and flat.
Like lilies you open, the fragrance goes to my head, my darling. I get everything that has been, don't matter no more.
Every time I move materials like this stone or timber, I use the opportunity for material selection and create preferences of what materials I want to use where.
So as we unload our cart, we do a bit of sorting for size, because when we're building the wall, it's good to know where our roughly different sizes are for filling in little pockets and so forth. So I'm stacking all the big ones really close, and I've got a pile of little ones over here.
With enough stone to complete the next section of our wall, we have a few other things to prepare before we start laying.
Just going to add a bit of mesh and hang it on the back of the wall, so as we pour the concrete later we can lock it in. We just keep doing this in layers, just like we lay the stone, and we'll tie together.
This new mesh we're adding overlaps with the existing mesh that we poured into the first part of this wall. By overlapping the mesh as we go, we'll create a strong engineered system. Before we start laying our next course of stone, we add fine gravel into the cracks between the other stones. We bring everything up to an even and flat height so it can support the next stone we're going to put in. Stone selection is a key part of this process, so we save all the really square block-shaped stones for our cornerstones to start our course with. We need cube-shaped, block-shaped stones for this process to work, because we're constantly building the wall flat and then starting over again. So we need a stone with a flat bottom and a flat face so it can sit tight up against our formwork but sit on the previous course. It'll probably never sit perfectly on the previous course, so we use small bits of recycled concrete or gravel chips to wedge it up to get it flat against the front formwork. With the cornerstone in place and secure, we just work our way along the course to the other side. These stones don't have to be as square and cubed as our cornerstone, as long as they've got a nice flat face to lay up against our formwork. We also try to make sure that these stones lay across the cracks in the stones underneath, which creates a strong and attractive wall. As we get to the end of the course, we set the other cornerstone in on the end and work our way back. And in this case, I'm using a screw to help secure this cornerstone to hold it into the right place. After adding gravel to fill any cracks between the stones and wetting the whole system down, we're ready to start backfilling our concrete. We pour our concrete in very gently as these stones are just leaning up against the form. We're using my usual custom concrete mix for this process, which is my 6:1 Portland cement gravel sand plus 1 shovel load of mortar. And in this case we've also added some pigment to help the appearance of the stone in case any of the concrete shows through the cracks. We just keep adding small batches of concrete as we've worked it in, because we're trying to get the concrete up to the same level as these stones to create a flat platform for the next layer of stone. Our cornerstone is sitting a bit higher than the other course of stones, so we just build up the concrete behind it, as we'll be adding another stone next to the cornerstone. The strategy in building this wall is to constantly keep creating flat courses so you can lay the next block on top with a nice T-joint. So the stone we're going to select to put next to this cornerstone is going to be roughly the same height. Once we've fit the stone snug up against the cornerstone, we go through the normal adjustments of putting small concrete chips under it to get it flat up against our form. This is what's going to create the flat stone wall look when we rip the form off. When we're satisfied the stone's in the right position, we backfill it with concrete and continue with our process. Here I'm adding a small stone to fill out a little void under this larger stone, which is part of the pattern of our wall. The large stones are surrounded by small stones, to keep resolving the stone wall into flat areas so another layer can be put on top. So we often use small stones next to the large stones. This creates a very attractive pattern in the wall. With this small stone in place, we just continue to agitate the concrete to get a really good adhesion and get ready to put the next stone in. We try and keep the pattern of mixing large stones with small stones. There are no strict rules in this stone wall process, but there is a formula we try to stick to, which leads to an attractive pattern and also a strong engineered wall. And that's the constant mix of the big and small stones, as I've just discussed. So after laying a couple of these larger stones next to each other, we're going to bridge these two large stones with a collection of small stones. Building walls can be hard work, but it can also be really creatively satisfying, as you're in complete control of what stones you want to use where. And it's quite a meditative process, placing one stone on top of each other. And then later on, when we rip our form out, we have this beautiful wall we've built. The other key part of this particular process of wall building is you can only really put 1 or 2 courses on per day, because you need the concrete to set up before you can put the next course on top. So this is going to take time for the wall to build up. After bridging this gap between the two larger stones with the little stones, we backfill them with concrete, creating a flat platform with this bridging of the small stones. We can squeeze 1 more stone on top before we finish this wall for the day.
Everything that has been don't matter no more. We've burned it. All those whirlwinds can't touch us no more. We've earned it. We've earned it.
With our stone wall up to the same height as our block wall, we can continue on with the engineering construction part of this wall system, which is to backfill the hollow block wall corner with concrete. This is part of the system that's going to hold this whole corner together, which has to hold up the hillside. We've poured an extensive amount of concrete over the rebar that we'd installed in the hollow block wall, and this is all part of how we're engineering a really strong corner system to hold this hillside up for many years. Now that the concrete's all set up, we can pull this form off. We just unscrew this brace we put on and remove the other screws from our form timbers, and we're ready to take a look at the stone wall underneath. The first thing we check when we pull the form off our wall is that no concrete had spilled out between the gaps between the stones. And if any has, because the concrete's only a day or so old, it can chip away quite easily and we can clean it up. We sweep up our excess gravel as we can reuse this later.
So we've just removed the form for our stone wall. We're just checking it to make sure everything's looking good. It's nice and flat. Now I'm going to add some form boards along here so we can build it up, because it's going to come up to this height.
I'm using one of my pre-formed panels that I often use for this type of application, as it's extra strong so the stone won't bow the timber out and we'll end up with a really nice flat wall. But any kind of strong, stiff timber can be used for this process. I just fix it in at a couple of key points and it's going to be ready for our next course of stone.
Mostly off track and under attack, so we've earned it.
We got this corner filled with concrete yesterday, because they're trying to set a heavy foundation here so our wall doesn't move when planted out. Yeah, today we're going to work on the section over here, this wall corner turnaround for the side of the ramp.
To lay the first course of hollow block for this corner, we have to re-expose the foundation we poured earlier. We had temporarily filled this part of the ramp with gravel so we could move materials in with the wheelbarrow. After thoroughly cleaning the concrete foundation, I place a few form boards to stop more gravel spilling back into it. I then start the process of laying the cornerstone and the blocks that lay beside it, much like we did on the other corner. Once I'm satisfied this first course of block is laid completely plumb and square, I start filling it with concrete to lock it in place.
Breaking feedback, unless I'm gonna stay right here. Stay until it disappears.
With the leftover concrete, I add another course to the natural stone wall.
One way, gonna lay down, be still, won't waste another tear. Wait till it disappears.
I need to move another batch of hollow block onto the site. I wanted to show you how I rub the hollow block on the road. This knocks off the little burrs that are created in the mold process. They can really get in the way of laying the wall flat.
Can I go to sleep, buried in my chest? The only thing that's left. If you have love, you wanna give me some, and I will wait for someone else to come. Oh, it's sad, but it feels right. Are we just hallucinating now? This is the final I just take a bow. While it all falls apart, guess you can't win them all. Oh no, oh no.
This retaining wall has a lot of hidden engineering strength behind it. So this wall is key in holding all this dirt up. It has to hold up many tons of soil, which is 1 meter high. So we've added some additional structure into this hollow block wall that's full of concrete. Today we're going to be installing extra block in the corner of this wall, which effectively doubles the thickness of the wall to help hold the whole system together. Our first step is to prepare the concrete block like we've been doing with our other concrete block, which is to make some cutouts on our wet saw so the rebar can pass through it. Because this part of the structure will be hidden behind the corner of the wall, we're not using the split face charcoal block, we're using a standard grey block. We can't quite make all the cuts we need to on the wet saw, so we finish off the block with our small grinder. After washing off all the dust, we place our block in the corner of this wall. I'm using some of the scrap concrete offcuts as packers to get this to the right height. We check with our level to make sure they're lined up and plumb and in the right position. With this cornerstone in place and set at the right level, we add 2 more blocks either side and then fill them with concrete. We pour our concrete in as gently as possible, as there's nothing actually holding these blocks to anything until we get this concrete set up inside them. After we've added our first small batch of concrete, we agitate it with our trowel and try and push the concrete underneath the big gaps that we've created. We work the concrete through all the blocks in all the nooks and crannies and make sure we've got a thorough coverage around the bottom of the blocks where the large gaps are. Once I'm satisfied that the bottom of the blocks have enough concrete to bond them to our foundation, I top it up with some more concrete and then smooth it off. We'll let this concrete set up as we move our attention to the other corner of the wall. We laid our starting blocks on the solid concrete stepped foundation we'd poured earlier. Now that the concrete's all set that we filled the blocks with yesterday, we're going to put another course on top so we can finish off this full turnaround wall section. We're using the same method we did yesterday, making sure the corner block's in the exact right position, then connecting the other blocks until we reach the end of our wall with our end block. When we're satisfied all the blocks are lined up and plumb, we fill them with concrete.
Peel off the layer and breathe. Live lift up your head and lead. Count the stars before you leave. Save a kiss, pretty please. Try to reminisce over me. Know that I will cherish your memory.
I'm adding rebar into the concrete to lock these blocks together, and we're also adding in some vertical pieces to lock the blocks in later, next week after this concrete sets up. Last week we got this corner set, been putting all our steel in as we go. So this is our lower end of the wall. We've got 2 courses down, and today we're going to be working on the 3rd course. We're going to need about 30 small pieces of rebar. These will be going in the slots that we cut in the blocks that connect through to the foundation. We need one of these small pieces of rebar sitting inside every slot of all blocks along this course of the wall. The steel rebar ties into the concrete foundation we're going to pour on the back of this wall later as a way of doubling the thickness of this wall on the first bottom 2 courses. This is a key part of the engineering of making this retain the soil behind this wall and will add a lot of strength to the system. We need to have these tied in before we put our next course of block on top. Here we're using purpose-made wire tabs for tying rebar down, but any tie wire could be used for this process. We need to tie this rebar together so when we pour the concrete later it doesn't fall out of alignment. I'm just pre-bending these small tabs of wire into a U shape so then I can twist them on with my fingers, and then we tighten the whole system up with the pliers. So the plan today is to cut all these blocks with their cutouts. The good news is we only really need to do this for the bottom couple of courses of this wall, because the top of the wall doesn't have any slots on the back of it as it stands free of the dirt. I like to get into a rhythm doing this kind of process for safety and also for efficiency. We've got a lot of blocks to cut, so we're going to cut them in batches, stack them neatly near where we need to use them, and when that's all done we can start laying the next course. Our wet saw can't cut the centre cross piece of these blocks, so we have to finish them off with our grinder. After cutting the notches, we knock them out with a hammer, then wash everything down, and then stack them neatly where they're ready to be used. I'm going to take you through the process of cutting one of these blocks in real time on my wet saw to show you some of the techniques, safety tips, and how we go about doing this effectively and efficiently. All the blocks we need to cut have been stacked neatly and are easily accessible for this process. I've set my wet saw up on a stable platform using a small pallet. The wet saw is designed to be operated in a completely flat setup, so the platform that's on rollers can efficiently slide in and out of the cutting zone. We gently glide the block through the cutting edge of the wet saw. There should be no resistance in this process when everything's lined up. We carefully and gently realign the block for each cut, taking extra care to keep our hands clear from the cutting blade. We do slow, controlled cuts. The saw cuts much more efficiently when it has time to be at speed and allow the water to keep it cool. So trying to cut too fast on your wet saw will blunt your blade and can lead to accidents. When we've done the final cut on our block, we always turn the wet saw off for safety purposes. When all our cuts are complete, we just tap out our slots with a hammer and stack our block ready for the next process of doing the cutout with a small grinder.
Standing underneath the lights, look into each other's eyes. Tired snowflakes are coming down, collapse into water when they hit the ground. I hear the sound of empty streets. Yesterday has gone to sleep, so all that's left is you and me. I can't promise you're the only thing I see. Close your eyes and let us fade away. Build a secret place for you and me. Let our minds be caught up in a dream.
Our first task is to dry set the wall, which involves laying all the blocks from one end to the other with our corner blocks to make sure everything's going to fit properly. The ramp corner side is already locked in and built up higher than this course, so that's going to be our starting point, and we're going to work to the other end of the wall. We lay each block tight to the block next to it and check that it's flat to the wall. After getting a couple of blocks in place and seeing that everything is lining up as it should, we place our corner block, as all these blocks are going to have to line up and match the end of this corner block. With our corner block set in place, we continue to lay out the other blocks. We do this process slowly and carefully, as these blocks are quite fragile and we don't want to chip any at this point. They should be laying out flat and plumb on this course, as we went to a lot of trouble with the first course getting the packers right to get it dead flat. I'm not worrying about any slight wobbles I come across as we lay these blocks at this point, because later on when we glue them down with construction adhesive, we'll be adding 1.5mm packers where needed to get them exactly flat. We can tell if the blocks are staying in alignment because they should be landing on the exact halfway point of the block below that we're laying them on. The other thing we're checking for in this dry layout process is that the blocks should be falling over the vertical rebar with plenty of room for the concrete to be around it. Once all the blocks are laid up to the corner, we snug in the corner piece and make sure everything's lining up. When we're satisfied the corner block is snug and tight to the blocks we've just laid and everything's looking plumb, we double check with our level and then move on to laying the other part of the wall on the other side of this corner.
As a young girl, the fields were mine. We played hide and seek for hours, raised our shadows among the pines. So offshore, playful and free.
We finish off the end of this short part of the wall with a half block that came pre-cut from the manufacturer. We make one last check of the wall to make sure everything's sitting flat and even. We're using a purpose-made construction adhesive that's specifically designed for gluing down cement block and exterior applications. We move one of the blocks out to create a gap in the wall so we can apply the glue and then return the block to the original position. After seating the block on top of the adhesive, we make sure it's sitting flat to all the other blocks in the wall and then check it for level. If there's a discrepancy in our level, we add a 1.5mm packer to keep it plumb. We continue the process down the wall, block by block, adding our glue, setting the block flat, giving it a tap with our rubber hammer to make sure it's in the right place, double checking with our level, and then move on to the next block. There's a consistent system to this process. We're adding the same glue pattern, little dots on the side, a full line along the front of the course, and making sure we put glue on all the heavy contact points, and constantly checking with our spirit level to make sure they're all dead flat and plumb, using our rubber hammer to bump the blocks subtly into exactly the right place. The glue we're using here doesn't really hold the wall up as much as just holds it together whilst we pour the concrete in. It's also going to help stop concrete oozing out between the cracks on the front of the face, so that's why we put a full bead along the front of the brick. On this upcoming block, I'm going to go through the whole procedure step by step of how we glue down a block that needs packers under it to adjust it to level. I test fit the block without glue to see what kind of level it's got. I use my spirit level to discern which side of the block is out of alignment. When I notice that it needs some adjustment with some packers, I add the packers underneath and double check with the level. Once I'm satisfied that it's going to be completely plumb and flat, I remove the block and apply my glue in the standard glue pattern, which involves a couple of large dobs on the side of the block I'm about to join it to, and a nice big thick bead along the front to help stop concrete oozing out onto our split face blocks. I then return the block hard up against the previous block that's locked in place, check it one more time with the spirit level, then use my rubber hammer to gently tap it into complete alignment with the other blocks. Double check it with my level and then move on to my next block.
Daydreamer, kidnap me. Take me back, all the way back to them days. Running around in a gown and a crown, barefoot. No mistake ever kept me late. We spent summers catching fireflies and winters on our skates.
So that concludes gluing down that entire course. So we'll let that set up before we backfill it with concrete. Part of the engineering design of this wall is for it to be double thickness on the bottom half of the wall, which is what helps hold it up against the hillside. So here we're preparing a concrete pour to fatten our wall up. We're framing it out with some of our scrap timbers and anchoring it to this tree stump, and using a piece of old plywood that I've used many times in these concrete pours.
We'll fill this with concrete this afternoon. That's going to add a lot of strength to this part of the system.
The construction plan for this corner of the wall was to tie these two corners together. The engineering part of this bond is invisible behind the wall, because in the finished result they're made out of two different materials, natural stone and split face hollow block. But hidden behind the facade of these walls, they're joined as one unit with concrete and reinforcement bar. So today we're going to be backfilling concrete in the hollow block wall to create this bond between the corners. We always wet the whole area down, as this will help the concrete adhere to the block and the foundation. We're using our standard concrete mix of 6:1 sand and gravel to Portland cement, with the additive bondcrete to help it bond to the block and the previous concrete foundation. I'm agitating the concrete with a piece of rebar so I can get it deep into the hollow block and throughout all the nooks and crannies. I often break up my concrete pours into pieces due to the logistics of how much concrete you can mix in one session. So today we're just trying to fill this corner.
Daydreaming is my new middle name. This is not a game for me. Imagining is my new best friend, and raise all I see. I got a PhD in love.
Now that we have this corner of the hollow block wall filled with concrete, we can continue on with the natural stone wall. As they join together in the corner, we build one level at a time. So every time the hollow block wall goes up a course, we incorporate another level of the natural stone wall, tied in with the rebar and the concrete behind it. I always like to start a new course with a nice large stone, as we can fit out smaller stones around it. We lay the flat side of the stone to our formwork, and in this case I'm propping it up with a piece of timber. With the stone secure in its right place and hard up against our formwork, we backfill it with our concrete and then add scrap bits of concrete to help stiffen the mix so the stone is supported and secure on the formwork. This was the concrete that we excavated from the old pathway when we started this project. I always save the concrete because there's many places to reuse it in projects like this. After adding the chunks of concrete, we push them in securely with our trowel, then add more concrete mix and work it in to get a really good bond. We just keep repeating the process of adding more scrap concrete with wet concrete mix to build up a flat wall behind our stone, so then we can add more stones on top that'll stay flat to the formwork. I add small gravel chips in the gap between the stone and the formwork. This is to stop the concrete from oozing out in between the stone courses. We're now ready to lay an appropriate stone next to the large one we laid earlier. We place the flat side of the stone hard up against the formwork and then fit it in tightly to position. We often need to pack a piece of scrap concrete behind it to hold it hard up against the formwork. With the new stone sitting flat against the form and in the right position, we add more wet concrete and scrap concrete to lock it in. I continue to backfill concrete and scrap concrete behind this new stone to stabilise it in preparation for the next stone we're going to add next to it. This next gap we're trying to fill in the wall is quite specific, so sometimes I have to try a couple of different stones to find the one that's going to fit the gap properly. With this stone securely in place, I backfill it as I did with the previous ones. With our concrete backfilled and flattened out with a nice stable flat platform, we're ready to put the next course on top. And we always start with a cornerstone. After securing our cornerstone in the normal way, backfilling it with concrete and recycled concrete chips, we need to do a little more work on this course to prepare it for the next large stones we're going to lay down. We do this by adding some small stones to completely flatten out this area. With the smaller stones filling these gaps between the larger stones, we're ready to put the next large stone on this course. This is the final course on this wall, so we have to make the top of it look good. So after securing this large stone in place, we work our way back into the corner with smaller stones to give it good stone coverage for the top of this wall. We're only finishing the top course in this small corner section today, as we've run out of stones. We need to go back to our stone supply to get more supplies.
So we're driving out to the stone supply today to get some more pink granite for our natural stone wall. Of course, part of living in the countryside is it's a beautiful drive wherever you go, from one place to the next. So I just enjoy taking a break, taking a rest from doing the hard concrete and block laying. We're going to hand pick some nice gravel blocks because we've got our wall kind of 2/3 finished. I always find driving through the countryside is always a good opportunity to kind of work on your mindfulness. Look at the trees as I'm driving by, look at the blue sky. Throughout my workday, I always like to try and spend a bit of time on mindfulness practice. I find you make better and clearer decisions. I'm just going to enjoy this country drive, go get some nice stone. Maybe this afternoon it'll be dry enough to put them on the wall.
Peel off a layer and breathe. Lift up your head and lead. Count the stars up before you leave.
Yeah, today we're doing a bit of rock selection at our local rock supplier. There's plenty of good rocks right here for the type of wall we're building. So let's get to it and select a few.
I will cherish your memories.
We're looking for stones that are going to fit into the wall easily. So they have to have a flat side that goes up against our formwork. We're also looking for some cube-shaped ones for our cornerstones. On top of that, we want mixed sizes and any other stones that catch our eye with some sort of attractive feature in them.
Tonight we'll turn minutes into days, and nothing's gonna make me look away.
This selection of stones should work well on what's left of our wall to build. And whilst we're here getting stone, we can get some more treated timber to finish off the corner of our wall. We built the first half of this treated timber retaining wall. Today we're going to finish the top section. We've been building this wall in sections for a couple of logistical reasons. One of them being the amount of timber that I'd have to transport here to build this entire retaining wall. Previously we completed the section that runs along the fence, and today we're going to complete the section that runs down in front of the shed. The treated timber retaining wall steps down with our ramp slope, so we decided to put an angle cut on these timbers that matches the ramp angle. We're just fixing these timbers down with heavy external screws. The owner of the property decided that she wanted to be able to sit in this corner, so we're going to be adding a 75mm thick piece of treated timber as a sitting bench once we install this last panel. I just measure and cut a couple of pieces to fit this corner. We want to put a bevel on them with our plane, and then we install them with our normal exterior fixing screws.
Yesterday there was sun and there was rain, beauty in the mundane. And as the light startled our eyes, we let go of disguise. And now there's something in the air and a sparkly shimmer on our skin.
Just going to lay down the next course of block wall.
I just lay the blocks out in what I call a dry set. It's also a good last opportunity to check for any defects in our blocks. So if we come across any with blemishes or chips on them, we can swap them out for another one. The corner block fitting perfectly into place is our indicator that everything's lined up properly, and we continue to lay our block around this corner until it runs into the natural stone wall. Our corner blocks in this wall are different from the other blocks. They're not hollow, they're solid. And that's part of their design because they have a split face that turns around 90 degrees around the face of the block. So I score the back of these blocks to help the concrete adhere to them. After gluing all these blocks down, the next thing to do is put steel in this channel. Every course of this hollow block wall gets steel laid horizontally inside its channels. When the steel rebar is not long enough to cover the entire length of the wall, we do an overlap of a couple 100mm for strength. The reinforcement bar in this project is a key part of the engineering strength of what holds this wall together. It's a combination of the concrete block, the concrete that we fill the hollow block with, and having enough steel inside to hold it together. One of the other features of this entire terrace project was the garden bed that we created here. So it makes sense with all the levels we're creating with this wall. And part of defining this garden area was to have a small wall dividing the gravel patio from the raised garden. This meant making a small design change on how we're going to establish this garden retaining wall. But after discussing it with the property owner, we came up with the idea of making a small extension of the hollow block wall. It's not unusual to want to make small design changes in garden retaining wall systems like this, but it did involve a few engineering challenges, one of which was we needed to incorporate a small foundation for this wall that would be locked into the foundation of the main wall. Because this small wall is going to be on the high side of our hill, so it was effectively a stepped foundation. So this small wall is only 3 block courses high instead of 5 like the main wall.
This morning we're going to backfill all this wall here. So yesterday we framed out foundation for this design change where the wall's going to wrap back into this little courtyard. This return here also adds strength for holding the wall up because it's exactly at the halfway point along this wall. And today we're going to backfill behind this wall. So our bottom 3 courses are locked into a 400mm wall. So when we pour out the back of this wall, we can pour into this system here because we've put all the rebar in, which is part of what's going to hold this wall up. It's a bit rainy today, so we're just going to wing it and see what we can get done. But the idea would be to have all this backfilled with concrete by the end of the day.
We're cutting up about 30 small pieces of reinforcement bar to tie our foundation into this hollow block wall.
Turn around and show your face. Let me see parts of you. Oh my, our bodies interlace, slow and easy. And I can reach you from the distance.
I do a quick count to make sure I've got enough small pieces of rebar. For each block in the wall has 2 slots cut in it, and we need a piece of rebar for each slot. It seems like a lot of pieces of rebar, but it's part of the engineering system of what's going to hold this wall up. The concrete that's poured into the back of this wall is going to lock into all this rebar. Once we've put all the pieces of rebar in place, we tie them all off with our tie wire. We're making sure we're tying them together extra strong in this application, because when we backfill this wall with concrete, we're going to be dumping it out of the barrow directly. So this rebar has to take a bit of force. We want it to hold together to keep its integrity for the engineering of this wall.
We will dance away the gloomy days right here. We are silver line, one of a kind, you and me.
The final piece of preparation for our reinforcement bar is to cut our vertical lengths for the wall. This is what creates the mesh system of rebar inside the wall, creating our engineering strength to hold the hillside up.
So this morning we're going to be pouring concrete inside this wall to lock it into this backfilled concrete foundation, because all this will be underground. We've got all our steel in. Once we have the concrete in this, we can go up the next 2 courses, which finishes the wall height.
We're going to be adding a large volume of concrete to this wall today. Part of doing a successful concrete pour is keeping a wet pour going, which means you don't want the concrete drying halfway through the pour of the system, as this will create a weakness in the wall. So our objective is to keep concrete flowing into the wall and keeping it wet enough so the wet concrete bonds to itself as we pour it out. I then start agitating this bed of concrete we added. We do this really thoroughly as we want to get all the air bubbles out and get a really good adhesion to the previous concrete we've poured in this wall. With enough concrete poured in the core of the wall, we start to pour concrete in the backfill area. This is the hidden part of the wall because it's under the dirt height, but this is what adds the extra strength to this wall. This massive concrete creates a step system in the wall, which is part of the engineering design for what enables this wall to hold up the tons of dirt that lie behind it. This part of the wall is actually double the thickness of the block, but hidden underground. As we're doing this backfill pour, we include the new foundation of our design change for our small extension on this wall. By pouring out this small foundation with the backfill all in one session and with all the steel we added, it makes it effectively one unit of concrete, which is what's needed to keep this wall in place.
So yesterday we filled out all this block and we poured out this backfill foundation, which is part of the sort of engineering strength of this wall. So everything that's underground is at least 400 wide, coming up to the dirt, and then what's above ground will be single block width. So we'll pull out all the formwork we have for this foundation today and backfill it with gravel, so we've got easy access from behind the wall for building it. We also pulled out this little foundation here where the wall turns back. That was a bit of a design adjustment to tie us into the deck back here. Got all our rebar set for the next 2 courses. We're just putting a rebar in every other block, because when I put the other 2 blocks on, there'll be another piece of rebar in here. And of course rebar along every course.
Laying this 4th course of hollow block becomes pretty automatic by now. We still have to be careful to keep it in line with the course below. When they manufacture the hollow block, it's not a perfect system, so you'll find very slight variations between each block. I try and mitigate this by keeping each block really tight to the block next to it as we lay them. We can tell if the blocks have laid out evenly by how the cornerstone fits on the other end. The only real difference in this 4th course is we're adding the 1st course of the small turnaround wall.
Turn around and show your face, let me see parts of you. Oh my, our bodies interlace, slow and easy. And I can reach you from a distance. I can, so beautiful. I can hear you within the silence. Ooh, we will
this course is add a small filler piece to the inside corner block. As it's not a genuine hollow block, I have to add this extra piece so we can pour concrete inside it.
And I can reach you from a distance. I can, so beautiful.
Before we complete the final course of hollow block in this project, I'm going to talk about the construction and design of this retaining wall and the reason why the top of this wall ends here in a step. It was all part of the design of incorporating this central garden bed into the terrace project. So it makes sense with all the levels we're creating with this wall. So we also constructed a rough natural stone wall that incorporates into the stepped block wall here on the main wall, which was part of creating a practical height for gardening at this end of the terrace. The property owner is a keen gardener, so it was important for me to facilitate this in the design of this garden. I prepare for laying this last course by adding the steel reinforcement inside the channels of the block wall. We're starting our layout on the far end and working our way back to where the wall ends in its step configuration. I'm laying the blocks out plumb and tight to the previous block. It's important to get these blocks as tight as we can get them to each other without pushing them out of alignment. This is how we keep the brick pattern matching the brick pattern in the lower courses. That's technically the last block in this wall. We're using one of the corner blocks to end this step in the wall as it looks more attractive.
So today we're going to glue the last course of bricks for this wall, level everything as we go. So we've got a few packers over here just to get this all dead flat. We'll glue it down with our construction adhesive.
We're using our usual technique to glue these blocks down. We remove the block, then remove the temporary packers and replace them with small pieces of packer as they can be hidden inside the block more easily. Then apply a nice thick bead of glue, replace the block in position and settle it in with our rubber hammer. Then double check our level before we move on to the next block. Last block in this row, we're using a corner block instead of our standard hollow block because it has a split face on the side and also the end, unlike the standard blocks. We glue this in place just like the other blocks. The difference with this block is it doesn't have a back to it, so we have to add a custom cut piece to add a backing to it so it'll hold the concrete when we fill this wall. Once the corner block's glued in, level and secure, we test fit this custom backing piece. When we're satisfied it's going to fit correctly, we glue this in as well. I tap the pieces in gently with my rubber hammer to make sure everything's flat and flush and plumb, and this completes this course of our block wall. I'm taking one final check to make sure that all my steel's in place before we start pouring concrete. I wet down the wall thoroughly because part of bonding all this concrete to the block is to keep everything damp and wet so the cement can adhere properly in the system. We start this concrete pour at one end of our wall and fill the chambers in the hollow block almost to the top. and let it spill over into the next chamber. Once we've added enough concrete that it's almost to the top of the wall, we start agitating with a piece of rebar. We want to get all the air out of the concrete and push it into all the voids inside the hollow block. I keep adding more concrete and agitating in until we get to the top of our concrete block. Once we have our concrete filled almost to the top on a section of wall, we add our rebar in, top it off with concrete and trowel it out flat. It's very satisfying finishing this part of the wall after all the work we've done, from excavation to foundations to gluing all the blocks, and now finally filling the top of the wall. With this first part of the wall completely filled, we just continue our process around the entire wall.
Love heart is not in vain. Scarred by the good fight. Weathered skin from the sun. We're proud you have lived well. Mud on your boots tell the story of where you've been. Traveled, beat up, born in with settled soul. Trust your God, you have earned at least that. Age has proven to be kind. Age has proven to be kind.
Well, we got it poured in. The rain kind of soaked us a bit, but rain doesn't affect this kind of concrete pour too much. And I just came back to check on it to make sure I wasn't streaking down the front of our stonework.
Before we cement the brick caps on top of our block wall, we have to address this junction point where the natural stone wall meets the block wall and the brick caps. I finish off the stone wall and remove the form before we move on to the brick caps. This morning we're going to pull off the form for this natural stone wall and see how she looks underneath. We're going to pull this apart a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. Just take our time so we don't injure ourselves or damage the wall or damage this deck. That completes revealing our natural stone wall. I'm just going to brush it off, get some of these rocks out, give it a tidy up. Little blobs of concrete that came through can just be chipped away. Once the concrete's still kind of soft, it's easy to just chip those out and it looks kind of natural. We put a bit of pigment in this concrete so it didn't stick out like horrible grey. It's got a sandstone pigment in there to sort of make it blend in. So that completes our natural stone wall tied into this deck. It's always a bit of a surprise when you pull the form off for this kind of stone wall, because as you're laying the stones, you're doing it somewhat blindly and you're just guessing how the stone wall's going to come out. So you never really know until you pull the form off and take a look. The stone layout looks quite random, but there's actually a lot of strategy and planning involved. All stone and brick walls have a structural engineering principle you have to adhere to make it come out strong and looking good. Part of that formula is to keep an even mixture of large and small stones. With this natural stone wall complete, we can now move on to the brick capping of the hollow block wall. The property owner chose this kind of brick capping because it matches the bricks on her house. Hollow block wall usually needs some kind of capping on the top of it because it doesn't look very attractive unfinished. So in this case, we've chosen these paving bricks that we also used in our ramp and step systems to tie the whole backyard design together. The next step in this project is to attach these pavers to the top of the wall. Part of the logistics of this particular job has been the limited access to the backyard. so I have to get them into the backyard by hand using my barrow. We make the most of having to handle all these bricks by using it as an opportunity for material selection. This particular pallet of bricks was a discontinued pallet, so these bricks have been sitting in the brickyard for a long time. Some of them are dirt stained and chipped. So as we move them on site, it creates a good opportunity to sort out the good bricks from the bricks that we'd rather not use. To avoid double handling these bricks, and due to the length of our wall, we're making stacks of bricks close to where we're going to be using them. This can avoid a lot of double handling, and every time we move the bricks, there's a risk we can chip them as well. Bricks thoroughly is really important. If they've got dirt or dust on them, the tile adhesive won't stick to them properly. I'm making my small stacks of bricks on top of timbers and pallets to keep them clean. I'm also keeping the good side facing up, so when we get to laying the bricks, we know what side we want to see face up. I'm scoring the top of our block wall with my trowel. This is going to help the tile adhesive adhere the brick to the wall. I'm laying my bricks out without tile adhesive just to see how the pattern's going to lay out along this wall. One of the other issues with these paving bricks is they're not all exactly the same, they vary quite a bit. So it's very hard to calculate how many will lay along a linear metre. So the easiest way is to just stack them out and see how they look. We're laying out these pavers with a slight overhang on either side because they're 220mm pavers and our wall is 190. Here you can see the strategy of having little piles of bricks spread throughout the wall system, so I don't have to walk too far to get the next brick to lay. This dry layout gives us one more chance to catch any defects in the bricks. Often we can just use the other side of the brick and move on. The other reason for this dry layout is to find out where these bricks fall on the corners. And as we can see here, our brick pattern is falling short. The best way to remedy this is to add small gaps in about 20 or 30 bricks leading up to this corner. By averaging that large gap into small gaps between all these bricks, it won't be detectable when we're finished, and the end brick can line up properly on the corner. Now that I'm happy where the end brick sits on this corner, I'm just going back through this entire row and averaging all the gaps to keep it really even. I check the layout on this short end of the wall and find the same issue. This time I'm taking a measurement of how far off these bricks are, so we can do a bit of a calculation of how big the gap should be in between the bricks. Because the wall's so short, it's a bit harder to hide the gaps here, so we go back and forth a few times until we get a really nice even spread of our gap.
So the layout for the end of this wall doesn't quite match up with our wall length. So my client wants me to use these tiles. These tiles are left over from the construction of the house. So the client wants to sort of resolve this little end by trimming these down and placing them here. So I'm going to cut these at 50mm. They should fit in this little corner piece. And these tiles are used throughout the sills on the house, and these bricks, these pavers are supposed to match the bricks for the house, so it makes sense on a design level, and they should just tuck in there.
After cutting them to size on the wet saw, I take them back and check them to see if they fit properly. I'll cement these in as we cement the bricks in later. In this project, I'm using a tile adhesive to glue these pavers to the top of our wall. This tile cement can look quite white or light grey when it dries, so we're adding a pigment to help it blend with the bricks in case any of it's seen. I'm using a powered mixing system with my drill so we can get a really thin, consistent mixture, which will help the pavers sit really tight to the top of the wall. The idea with this tile cement is to get enough on to get a nice tight sandwich in between the brick and the wall, but not too much because we don't want the material oozing out under the bricks and staining the split face block. Once we've got a nice flat bed of tile adhesive on the top of the wall, we butter the back of the bricks with the tile adhesive to get a really good bond between the two. Here I'm using a paint scraper to apply the adhesive to the back of the brick, as it works more efficiently than the trowel. I'm careful to make sure the tile adhesive is only in the centre part of the wall and not on the outer edges. This is part of our system for not letting any of the tile cement get on the front of the wall. Part of managing the process effectively is only sticking down small groups of bricks at a time. After I've completed sticking down one of our batches, we double check everything with a level and make sure all the bricks are lined up correctly. The idea is to get them roughly set, and then we can do slight adjustments later with our rubber hammer and our level. Once our batch of 5's all set in place, we use the rubber hammer and the level to make sure everything's lined up properly, and then check for spills and do a quick clean up with my sponge I have on hand, then move on to the next batch, as it's important to not let this dry on the bricks. This end of the wall is where we went to all this trouble to make sure the natural stone wall and these bricks would segue together nicely. With one section of our wall complete, we can settle into the rhythm of this process.
A whole lot of ticking, but not enough time. A whole lot of work for a trophy wife like me. Oh. Slow traffic caused me a stress. Show no panic, I'm just born in a dress. And I know that I'm older, I'm done. I'll do what I want. I'll do what I want.
This is a good example of how we apply the tile adhesive. After getting a decent amount on top of the wall with our trowel, we then smooth it off with our paint scraper. I then remove the excess with my trowel to be used on the next batch. I take my time buttering the adhesive on the paver. I want to get good coverage and work it into the texture of the paver so we get a really good bond between the wall and the brick.
Spending a Sunday at the gym, trying to fit in. Counting the days until I meet my future husband. I try to be kind to myself. I said, girl, you got this. A whole lot of ticking, not enough time, not enough time. A whole lot of sweat for a trophy wife, trophy wife.
So yesterday we completed capping this wall, the idea being that this colour ties back into the original brick of the house behind me. One of the little details we did on this wall is these tiles are on the windowsills of the existing house. So we incorporated these little leftover pieces just in the end of the wall here.
With the retaining wall complete, it's time to turn our attention onto the ramp, where we'll be using more of this yellow brick, but first we have some concrete to form out. The first thing we've got to do is remove some of this temporary scaffolding I put together to hold the gravel up whilst we got this wall built. This little retaining wall was part of the structures we had to put together, just so we could keep this ramp in use for bringing materials in throughout this project. So now we're at the stage where I have to remove it so I can build a proper form to pour the concrete here. This upper part of the ramp already has an existing concrete foundation we poured out when we did our wall foundation. So I just need to dig the gravel out to expose this original foundation, and we're going to pour our concrete on top of this. This is going to set the edge for this little concrete pour we're going to do along here. That's why we had to wait before this was finished before we could do it. With this top edge all plumb and secure, we just need to add a bit of plywood backing to hold the concrete for when we pour it out. Just like on the upper ramp, I'm recycling the same piece of formwork I used for this lower ramp previously when we poured out that outer edge. Once I'm satisfied the ramp part fits properly, we have to add an extension for this bottom part that's going to incorporate the lower path. We add a bit of plywood to hold the concrete in, fix it off with some screws, and then backfill it with some gravel to make it really solid. We do one final check along the entire formwork to make sure everything's in place. Then we wash the whole thing down in preparation for pouring our concrete. Once we've poured a small bed of concrete in the form, we organise our rebar to make sure it's in the right place. I'm just shoring up the end of our formwork here with a couple of heavy pieces of concrete so this wood doesn't move whilst we pour more concrete in the system. I continue to agitate the concrete into the rebar and then top it up with more concrete. It's important we get the bottom part filled first and work our way up because we're working on a ramp. That's part of the key of getting the concrete to settle properly, is to start from the bottom and work your way up. I'm trying to pour this as carefully as possible because I'm trying to avoid getting any concrete on the cracked face wall. Once I've got enough concrete in the form, we agitate it thoroughly as normal. I continue adding more concrete, agitating it and troweling it out. When our forms get filled with concrete to the top of the timbers, we just smooth it out with our trowel and let it dry.
We could get out of town, see the beautiful world around, wanna see it now. Pack our bags and get in that car, leave a little note and we'll drive real far. Let's get out, we can leave this city.
We're going to finish off this garden bed today, clear out some of the unwanted plants, fill it, complete our treated timber wall on the other side, put a rock wall through here. That's all part of completing this whole zone with our block wall and stone wall.
Building this retaining wall has created a central garden area, but we have a little more construction to complete the perimeter of it. We're constructing the treated timber retaining wall with this galvanized H-bar. So I have to pre-drill some holes in the steel H-bar so we can attach it to these sleepers. I'm attaching the H-bar to the structural part of the deck to lock in these treated timber sleepers. I'm just adjusting these sleepers with some packers to get them to the right height before I drill some pilot holes and screw them off. I move on to the other end of this timber retaining wall and screw them off into that H-bar. Some of the plants are staying in this garden bed, but some need to be removed. So we did a bit of excavation and hacking back of unwanted plants before we started to build our rock wall. The idea was to build a natural, rough, dry stone wall, the same height as the top of our retaining wall. So we created a foundation out of recycled concrete, as this part of the wall wouldn't be seen because it was going to be buried under the soil. We added some gravel to the recycled concrete to stabilize it. Once the first row of stones is stabilized, you can start adding rocks on top. Now that I have one end of the wall up to the height we need, I continue on the other end of the wall to lay the base out. While one side of the garden bed was still open, we were able to use the barrow to dump some of this volcanic gravel we wanted in the garden bed. With the treated timber retaining wall in place, I add the rest of our volcanic gravel and then move on to building up the soil in front of the rock wall we're building. We've made a good start on this garden bed. It's got a few more things to be added before it's complete. We're going to be getting some more rock in and we've got to fill up a lot more topsoil. Then the plants will go in. The next day we purchased and added more rock to get our wall to the right height, added more topsoil, and now the garden bed's ready for planting. The next step in completing our ramp was to finish off these two small foundations that create this bottom platform.
Wanted to use this yellow brick because it matches the house that you can see in the background, so we've used it on the top of the walls, and we've used it to sort of create a border for this gravel ramp that goes around the corner of our wall. We already have a nice staircase on the existing deck, so the idea was to create something you could use for wheeled things like trolleys and wheelbarrows and lawnmowers to get up and down from this height down to this height.
I'm starting with the excavation of 2 small trenches to give us room to build our formwork for the concrete we're going to be pouring in. But in this particular circumstance, I have to look out for the drainage that I installed previously when we were building the wall. So I have to be extra careful and take it easy with this mattock so I don't punch a hole in the pipe that's hidden underground here. I'm constructing a timber formwork to create a concrete bridge between our 2 previous poured foundations on the sides of this pathway. I install the second formwork into the trench, which is essentially identical to the first one. I'm mixing the concrete out on the front of the property and transporting it in with my barrow and tubs. We just keep adding concrete, agitating it in with our trowel to take all the air bubbles out and push it into all the nooks and crannies. Once we've added enough concrete, we start tapping it with a hammer. This will make the concrete sink a little bit, so we add a little more and then screed it off with our trowel and move on to the next form. This morning we're going to take out the formwork for this concrete we poured yesterday because we used some rapid set concrete in there, mixed in to help it set faster. I often add rapid set or a concrete accelerant if I need a form to set up more quickly than normal.
Well, today's task is going to be preparing for putting our bricks down, our paving bricks, on these concrete foundations we poured. And then we're going to have decorative gravel filled in between them. So we're going to go through all the procedures of just getting these stuck down nice and flat and plumb and lined up. These particular pavers don't all match exactly due to the way they've been manufactured, so it was a little fiddly to get them all sort of lined up, but we've done it nicely here and we'll go through all the steps.
One of the last things I need to do to prepare before we do our dry layout is to do a light grinding of our entire foundation to get rid of any concrete bumps that were created when we poured our formwork. I'm now giving it a thorough wash down so we can remove any residue left from the grinding and any small pebbles and grit. Then we just have one final check of the whole foundation before we start putting our bricks down. This dry layout is extra important for these particular pavers because they're all slightly different sizes. Once we finish laying out all our bricks, we make one last double check to make sure that everything's in order before we start cementing them down.
Could you listen to somebody else? Will you only drink from the thoughts of yourself? Are you under the canopy spell?
I'm using a tile cement product instead of mortar to stick these bricks down. I find it more effective than using normal mortar. I've added some sandstone pigment to help it blend if you see it in between the bricks. The natural product is very white. I'm just transferring it from my mixing bucket into a smaller tub. Because we'll be working at ground level, it'll make it easier to access. To help keep things manageable, I work in groups of 5 bricks at a time. After removing a group of bricks to create a gap, we give it a quick wash down and then set ourselves up to add our mortar. We want a nice bed of mortar to have full contact with the foundation and the bricks. So after spreading out our mortar on the foundation, we butter the back of the bricks so we have extra adhesion to the whole system. I then repeat the process with the following bricks. The idea is to get them roughly set and then we can do slight adjustments later with our rubber hammer and our level. Once our batch of 5's all set in place, we use the rubber hammer and the level to make sure everything's lined up properly, and then check for spills and do a quick clean up with my sponge I have on hand, then move on to the next batch. After clearing our batch of bricks, washing down the area and sponging the excess water off, I set 10mm packers out, as this is how I'm going to get the pavers to match the drain height. This bottom area of the pathway is a little trickier than the rest because we have this drain we've got to match the height to. After being satisfied that the 10mm packer will get the brick to the right height, we spread out our tile adhesive on our foundation in the usual way, but take extra care to not push these packers out of alignment. We need to apply enough cement so it's sitting higher than the packers. This way we'll get good contact between the brick and the foundation. I then repeat the procedure we went through earlier of buttering the bricks to make sure they have a really good adhesion, laying them in place, checking their alignment, And in this case, we have to do a little extra cleanup because of the thickness of the cement we've put under our bricks. I then set the last brick in this row to complete this section. I left this one till last as it joins onto the next row that runs across this pathway. Now that the most difficult part of this process is complete and our pavers are matching this drain perfectly, it's just a matter of continuing the same process over and over. I actually find a lot of enjoyment about doing repetitive process like this, especially when you've staged everything really well.
So easy to drive on, but not what it seems. The poison is spilling upstream, and it's taking out every living thing. Every living thing. Who told you that you were no good? There's no use in trying, and even if you could, it wouldn't come out like it should. This stubborn kudzu just covers these words. Could you listen to somebody else? Will you only drink from the thoughts of yourself? Are you under the canopy spell? You dig in your heels and spread the disease.
As I move up the pathway, I constantly restage for each row of bricks I want to glue down. There's not a lot of room to work in, and I want to be really careful not to bump the bricks I've already glued down. I use my cement trowel and paint scraper to get the general volume of the product onto our foundation. When I'm satisfied with how the materials spread out, I use the tile trowel. I rake back over the tile adhesive. This creates ridges, which is going to help our brick adhere to the foundation. By dragging the tile trowel on a 45-degree angle through our adhesive, it's going to leave behind a measured ridge. This is a key process in achieving the right amount of material in between the brick and the foundation. When this process is working effectively, there should be a build-up of cement on the tile trowel. We just scrape this off back into our bucket for use later. With our bedding of tile cement prepared, we now apply tile adhesive to the bottom of the brick surface. I then put the paving brick in place and squeeze it into our product. It should feel a little slippery and wobbly. That way we know we've got a really good contact with our cement. With all the bricks in place for this section, I just go back over them lightly with my rubber hammer to make sure I've got a really good adhesion. Then I check the whole row with my level. With this section of brick complete, we move our staging area up the path and continue our process.
Let's get out, we can leave this city. Let's drive to the open air. Yeah, the countryside is so pretty, with the wind blowing in your hair. We can look back someday. Baby, don't you understand that we only get one life? I wanna make it count, honey. Come on now and take my hand. Hey, darling, can I tell you what's been on my mind?
With the completion of the brick edging on this pathway, we're now ready for the final stage of this project, which is adding the golden path gravel. We're going to need a significant amount of gravel to finish off this terrace project, so I've ordered in 3 meters of material. It's a 50-50 mix of packing sand and a product called golden path. By mixing these 2 types of gravel together, you get a really solid product once it gets compacted into the ground. The packing sand helps everything bind together, and the golden path adds the attractive golden pebble look.
We're going to cover all this with our golden path special gravel, decorative gravel, about 50 mil, about this thick. Because now that our primary engineering and building is complete, We finished the garden bed and all the walls are done. This is the best part, is putting this top coat on. It'll start to look like a finished backyard, at least in this section anyway.
Even adding our gravel that seems simple requires a bit of a strategy. The first part of our plan was having an adequate space to dump this material that was easy for the truck to dump and is also easy for me to transport into this backyard. I need to mix these two different gravel products together. So as we move the material into the backyard, it's a good opportunity to start this mixing process. I'm alternating shovel loads of the different material into the wheelbarrow as a way of getting this mix started, and then we'll be able to finish it off in the backyard with our rake.
Oh, I will open up my eyes so I can see the light. Oh, and I'll try to spread my wings so I can fly.
I now spread this gravel mix out about 50 mil thick over the entire finished surface of our project. We rake it back and forth to help mix the two different gravel types together and create an even surface.
Oh, and the darkness starts to fade. Feels like things are gonna go my way. I'm gonna let the sun shine in the day. Oh, I will open up my eyes so I can see the light. Oh, and I'll try to spread my wings so I can fly. Oh, and the darkness starts to fade. Feels like things are gonna go my way. I'm gonna let the sun shine in the day.
Once I've got the corners and edges to the right height, it's easy to fill the middle in and smooth it out to the right 50 mil depth. Here you can see me using the paving bricks we just finished laying as an indicator to get the gravel to the right depth. I randomly stomp along the gravel to compact it as we're putting it in. Patio area completely filled with gravel and flattened out, it's time to move on to the ramp that wraps around the outside of our retaining wall. It was my pleasure to create these videos in the hope it might assist you in carrying out similar projects in your own backyards, ranging from our excavation and foundations to the hollow block and natural stone walls. If you have any questions regarding the construction or engineering of any of these projects, don't hesitate to ask in the comment field of these videos. I'll do my best to answer them.
If you